Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to our worship service here on this extremely beautiful spring morning. I hope everyone's enjoyed the weather this weekend, a lot more than the weather at the end of the week. I am obviously not Bart, but I will be continuing the study for this week. This weekend is the big musical extravaganza at Fried Hardeman, making music. So Amelia is in that, so the Rogers went down to watch that and be with her, and I think David Rader is also in that, so that's where the Raiders are this morning. And I think from what I heard, everybody had a very good time, and that finishes up on Saturday night, but I'm sure they'll be worshiping with family and then heading back here sometime today. But Bart asked me to take over this week's study for him. After spending a quarter peering into the mysteries of Revelation, you'll be happy to know that Bart has not developed the ability to be in two places at once. So there's nothing quite that mystical in the book of Revelation, fortunately. I know Bart likes to summarize or bring you up to date on the study so far at the beginning of each week, and I've just taken Bart's PowerPoints, put my own information on them, and we'll continue with what he's been doing. Obviously, I can't do it quite the same, but I'll try to keep it as uniform as possible. The revelation of Jesus Christ, and we know this is a 2-quarter course, and we're just getting into, this is the second week of the second quarter. So, and having not been up here for a couple of quarters, I can't find the exact place to get the clicker. I may have to stand on, this would be fun for the entire class, wouldn't it? I think Nick is coming to the rescue, as usual. But given that people have worked without PowerPoint for a long time, I think we can at least work through a little bit. Remember early on the first few weeks of this class, we talked about those letters. You know, the beginning of the book is a very important part. It sets the stage for the whole thing. But when you think about Revelation, you don't think about those opening letters to the 7 churches of Asia. So, but that was the important part. And then the vision of the Lamb, and we found that the Lamb was found to be worthy to open the scroll. We saw the scroll with the 7 seals, and no one was able to open it, and John wept because of that, which is an indication that what was in that scroll was very important, something that needed to be revealed. And then the Lamb was found to be worthy to open the scroll, the seals of the scroll, and to reveal what was on the inside. And so then the past few weeks we've seen the opening of those seals. The first 6 seals were opened, and then there was a pause. And then the 7th seal was opened, and from the 7th seal we saw the trumpets. There was a revealing going on in each of those seals, and the 7th seal is now 7 trumpets. And just like the seals were divided into a group of 4 and then a group of 3, so the trumpets were divided and also into a group of 4 and a group of 3, and Bart got through the 4 last week, and these are all afflictions upon the land, earthquakes and volcanoes and destruction in the seas, all taking a third of a limited amount of destruction. But they're all focused upon the earth, and you can imagine by extension the economic welfare of the Empire of Rome. And after that fourth trumpet blew, then there was an eagle which flew in the heavens and said, "Woe, woe, woe," to the inhabitants of the earth. In fact, we could just go back and read that in chapter 8. verse 13, and I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of the heaven and saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. So whatever these three trumpets, and two of them we're going to talk about today, it's very dire tidings for the world, for the inhabitants of the earth, because of what will happen when these three trumpets are blown. So here in chapter 9, we will look into the fifth trumpet and see what calamity that brings. Oh, something happened. No, just a flash. At this point, I'm not quite at a standstill. For the moment, we'll just read chapter 9 down through through verse 12, and we'll try to figure out what's going on. And at that point, we may just need to manually, or to have somebody at the desk advance my slides for me. We could do that. So Revelation chapter 9. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon. One woe is past. Behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things. So now we have the bottomless pit and the smoke and the locust, and I see I have a PowerPoint. So this is the fifth trumpet, the fallen star and the bottomless pit. The bottomless pit seems to be the same thing or the same idea as recorded in the book of Luke, called the abyss, when the demons inhabiting the Gadarene demoniac begged Jesus not to send them into the abyss. It appears to be the same thing, or the same kind of thing that is being referred to here as a bottomless pit, which makes it seem to me to be an area, a place where evil could be restricted or constrained, where God, and the implication is that God is containing evil, is keeping it from working its will on the earth. And so this bottomless pit represents evil, if not entirely locked away, because there's always evil on the earth, at least constrained, restricted in a great degree. Now we read at the beginning, a star fallen from heaven to earth. And immediately the mind and most people who interpret this passage seem to go directly to, okay, what's the star? And now I think the emphasis of this passage really is on the pit, and especially what comes out of the pit, not so much on how it gets opened, but there's a lot of speculation about that. So let's take a look at that real quickly. And one commentary I read said this absolutely positively has to be Satan, because Satan is referred to as fallen star a couple of times in the Bible, and gave a couple of verses, and we'll look at those real quickly. But it ends up not being quite what it looks like from that passage. For instance, one of those passages given was Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Luke chapter 10 and verse 18 says, we're going to switch out controllers here. Thank you. Success. Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And this is a passage I've seen many times referred to in an explanation of the origin of Satan. Jesus said he saw him fall like lightning from heaven. The only issue is, if you back up just one verse in this passage and read it with a little bit of context, then the 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Now, this would be a very strange time to start talking about the origins of Satan, it seems to me. And now, it is possible that Jesus is trying to warn his disciples, saying, well, don't be too puffed up in this knowledge. Don't be too proud of yourselves, because even Satan once had a very high level and fell like lightning, and so you could too. But it doesn't appear to me, in reading Jesus' words in the New Testament when he's warning of moral dangers, he doesn't tend to be cryptic. Usually he's more straightforward. And so it seems to me much more likely that this passage is referring not to Satan's origin, but to what has just happened. That Satan has had a severe reduction in his power because of what the 70 had just done. They went out and they taught, and they taught the gospel, and they were able to cast demons out. This is sort of the limited commission. This is the beginning of the preaching of the kingdom. And its effect, Jesus says, is to cause Satan to fall like lightning from heaven. He has been struck a terrible blow, and his power has been diminished significantly. So it doesn't look to me like it's a description of Satan's beginning. Another passage that came up is Isaiah 14. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. So that's another passage that's typically talked about, referred to Satan, and it uses the name Lucifer. And Lucifer is a name that, of course, everyone uses for Satan, basically because of this verse, because I don't think the name appears anywhere else. But let's take a look. Let's take a little step back and look at this passage also in context. In verse 3, it says, It shall come to pass in the day the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve, that you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, and then everything else, including the passage that we just read in verse 12, is a part of that taunt, that song aimed at the king of Babylon, who will have been beaten, will have been overthrown. So actually, Lucifer, the name here, which means, I think, bringer of light, and it's a name referred to the morning star or the evening star. Suddenly I've forgotten that. But it's referred to the king of Babylon. So this passage doesn't actually refer to Satan either, but it's two passages that, taken by themselves out of context, often make people think of Satan. And we do have good reason to think that Satan was some sort of a deposed or fallen angel who had rebelled against God. But and so we tend to see a passage that kind of looks like it's describing that. We jump at it and take it. But these two passages do not appear to me to be referring to Satan. And therefore, doesn't seem to me to be necessary that the fallen angel or the star that has fallen in Revelation chapter 9 doesn't necessarily refer to Satan. I know that's a long time to spend on a something that I don't actually believe to be the explanation, but it's the one that's going to come up the most. People say, oh yeah, Satan's coming down, opening the bottomless pit. Well, not necessarily. Shelley calls the star a messenger. And there's also some discussion about, it says, I saw a star fallen from heaven. It doesn't, the grammar of that text doesn't suggest that he's seeing the star falling, but rather he sees a star that had fallen. Or also, I've read in at least one commentary that the text, the word could mean or could be the same, synonymous with descended. I saw a star that had descended from heaven, which is a kind of different connotation. Fallen, we think, as an accident or some kind of violent thing, whereas descended is deliberate and controlled and purposeful. So some explanations are that this is an angel who is doing the will of God, a messenger, as Shelley calls him. Someone suggested that this is, in fact, the Word of God that has descended from heaven to us, and it ultimately is in a way responsible for opening the bottomless pit. Because when people reject God, when especially if we're talking about a society, a culture, completely rejecting God, then in order to do that, they have to turn away from him and really do more evil than they would have done if they had simply not known about him to begin with. And so in rejecting God, they themselves open up the pit of complete domination by Satan. That's one explanation. But like I said, there's a lot of conjecture about that, and the emphasis of this passage is on what comes out of that pit rather than the opening of it. So this smoke comes out of the pit. They open the pit, and smoke comes out, and the smoke hides the sun. And it darkens the sky. I think it's significant that it hides the sun. I think that's maybe symbolic of hiding the truth or cutting the people off from any semblance of truth or illumination. This smoke hides the sun and darkens the air, and it makes the world dark. And it's like the smoke of a great furnace. And then the locusts come. There's some thought that this passage means that the smoke was really, what appeared to be a cloud of smoke was really a big cloud of locusts. But I think a close inspection indicates that this really is referring to smoke. And then out of the smoke come this cloud of locusts. And these are unusual locusts. They have power like scorpions of the earth. Scorpions are animals or creatures known to pack a pretty powerful wallop. They sting with their tails, and that is known to be extremely painful, but not deadly. It doesn't usually kill people, but boy, it leads to a load of suffering. I think folks from out, we don't have a lot of scorpions around here unless they're in some kind of insect collection, but out in the Southwest they have scorpions, and they're known to be pretty painful if you get a sting by one. So that seems to be what is being referred to here. These things have power to cause a lot of suffering. Now, these scorpions these locusts are interesting in another way, because they're not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or a tree. No grass, no plants, flowers, wheat, crops seem to be included in that, or any tree. But only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So who's that? Yeah, those who are not sealed by, those who do not belong to God, who are not his people. These scorpions are headed after them to torment them, not to kill them, but to torment them, to create suffering. Whereas the grass, the plants of the earth are protected, and so are the Christians from this particular affliction. And so it's an interesting thing about these locusts now is that they're very much unlike locusts. They don't eat what locusts do, and also they seem to be able to sting like scorpions. So you have to wonder, why locusts? Could have called this, John this vision could have been shown to him in a lot of ways, and these things could have been called a lot of different things, but why locusts? Why do you suppose locusts were chosen as the word with which to describe these creatures? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Locusts had the word locust, I think, to the mind of that part of the world at that time would cause a shudder as soon as it came out of your mouth, wouldn't it? Because people knew what they could do and knew how much devastation, how much destruction could be created by these little tiny creatures. And add to that the fact that there is a history with locusts, that the people who were both Jews or Christians who were students of the word understood locusts to carry with it a lot of historical significance. For instance, that was the 8th plague on the Egyptians, locusts, and they were the normal locusts that ate trees and plants and everything. So that was something that would be conjured up immediately in the minds of people when they hear locust. And also, it was somewhat symbolic of God's judgment, and I meant to actually leave that for just a moment until I read ahead a little bit. But I'll go ahead and skip up. In verse 7, the shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women, teeth like lions, and breastplates like iron, and their sound of their wing was like chariots and horses going into battle. And then they had scales like scorpions, or tails like scorpions. So these are really remarkable creatures. And they bring to mind a little bit a description in the book of Joel, that I think might also have been brought to mind by this description in the book of Revelation to people who were to Joel's audience. In Joel chapter 1 and verse 6, for a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion. And also he is talking about locusts. That's what precipitated this prophecy, was a plague of severe intensity against the land. And then in chapter 2, beginning in verse 2, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people come, great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds, so they run. With a noise like chariots, over mountain tops they leap, like the noise of a flaming fire that devours the stubble, like a strong people set in battle array. Before them, the people writhe in pain. All faces are drained of color. They run like mighty men. They climb the wall like men of war. Everyone marches in formation, and they do not break ranks. They do not push one another. Everyone marches in his own column. Though they lunge between the weapons, they are not cut down. They run to and fro in the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter at the windows like a thief. So there's a lot of similarities between that description of John in Revelation and this from Joel. And I think the significance is primarily, well, two things. One, this is a terrifying image. John is not just describing even an ugly little creature, little insect that's destructive. He is describing something of otherworldly terror. This is not something that anyone could see or even imagine before John's explanation. This is terror beyond human capability to understand. But it also, I think, by this similarity, by the fact that it's locust and it brings up the image of the plague, and also it's so evocative of this image in Joel. And this image in Joel is talking about judgment. Like, this is a judgment on Israel. And so this similarity in Revelation, I think, tells John's readers that this is part of God's judgment on their oppressors of the Roman Empire. The word locust brings with it a lot of historical illusions, and I think people reading this would understand that there is judgment on Rome, but that this judgment is limited. They are not allowed to kill. They're only allowed to torment. Hopefully, we assume, to cause people to come to their senses a little bit. We'll see later at the end of this chapter that hope is generally not realized. So there's only one thing about locusts that are similar. In verse 5, and they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. 5 months is apparently, I'm no expert on insects, but apparently the lifespan of a locust. So that is something that is kind of like locusts. This is only going to stay around for 5 months. 5 months, of course, in Revelation is liable to mean anything except 5 months. It's a short time, though. I think we can all see that this will be very difficult to endure, but it will end, and people will get past it. And then, if they're determined in their evil ways to stay with them, then they'll get through this. And so this will not force them. This will not force anyone to stop. It will not force the Roman Empire to change its attitude toward God and toward his people, but it will definitely give them a reminder if they're willing to accept it. So what comes out of the smoke is scorpions. And in those days, in verse 6, men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. Kind of gives you an idea of the suffering that is going on. It's not just a little bit of pain, a little bit of discomfort, but people are going to seek death, and they're going to not be able to find it. It's kind of worse than death. It's as if by prohibiting the locust from killing, God is making sure not just that suffering, but people cannot escape this judgment. They're allowing the locust to kill them would be like doing them a favor. God's not going to allow them, because he's going to make sure that everyone understands if they have the capacity and the willingness, they're going to understand what is going on. And then the other point about this is their king. Before we move on to the next trumpet, they had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek has the name Apollyon. And these names are associated with destruction. which is obviously what locusts do. Abaddon in Hebrew, in Greek, Apollyon. Now that name by itself has caused a little bit of conjecture, because it's so closely related to the name Apollo, who of course was one of the principal Greek gods, and also the one with whom Domitian identified himself. You know, the Roman emperors, of course, part of the issue that we're seeing in the background of the book of Revelation is that the Roman emperor required that people worship him. And for the average Roman who worshiped more gods than he could count anyway, this was no big deal. Just add one, make another sacrifice. But for the Christians, of course, who would worship the one God, this was an impossibility. And so this was the beginning of the source of the persecution of the Christians that is being addressed here in Revelation. The beginning was that they were being required to worship the Roman emperor, which they could not do, and there were consequences, legal consequences, and things that tended to result in persecution of Christians if they did not. So the fact that some commenters suggest that this name Apollyon is intended to bring the image of Apollo, and kind of a sideways reminder that the person who's leading all this, who's causing all of this harm to come upon the Romans, is in fact the Roman emperor, Domitian, who is demanding that he be worshipped, and thus he's in effect the one opening the bottomless pit. He's the one who's causing the wholesale rejection of God and bringing all this evil upon the people of Rome. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, destroyer. And I haven't. I think the Hebrew word Abaddon means essentially the same thing, destroyer. So it's really conjecture as to whether it's intended to make people think it's Domitian, who's not obviously not doing it on purpose, but responsible for this evil. But it's clear that the word destruction is intended to be associated with, the idea of destruction is intended to be associated with this trumpet, with this woe, in many different ways, in the words used for the king, in the identification of locusts, and in the description. Destruction is coming about. I'm a little behind. The sixth trumpet now. Verse 13, then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. By these three plagues a third of mankind was killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. But the rest of mankind, who were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. So the sixth trumpet blows, and there's a voice from the altar that orders the release of these four angels that had been bound by the river Euphrates. There's two, I think, significant things here. One is that the voice comes from the altar. It's not clear who says it, but this altar is before God. So it's clear that this voice is bringing God's own orders to this, that God has heard. As earlier we saw that altar, we heard prayers being offered to God with incense on the altar. God hears that, and now this order of destruction really is coming from God's presence. That is, it carries with it divine authority and God's own awareness of what is happening. So what happens next is directed by God. I think that's the implication of that. And you've got these 4 angels bound by the river Euphrates. The Euphrates is significant for a number of reasons, but principally it was the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire. It was beyond this point where the Romans looked and said, this is where they would tend to look if they were looking for trouble. If you asked the Romans if there's going to be trouble in the empire, where's it going to come from? And they would point in the direction of the Euphrates. Beyond the Euphrates were the Parthians and their skilled cavalrymen. They were, Shelley points out that they had defeated the Romans in a couple of battles in AD 62 and 53. So the Romans worried about them, probably more than anything else. So to point to the Euphrates and say these 4 angels tends to bring up the idea of some foreign power encroaching on the Roman Empire. Yes. Yes, it was also the eastern boundary of the Promised Land. So it's an important river. And it's outside of that. It's at this river where these 4 angels are bound. I really think that the primary implication here is for an external power to encroach upon the Roman Empire. Because what we saw in the 5th trumpet seemed to indicate something of internal corruption. So Rome becomes corrupt internally and weakened, and then once it's in its weakened state, external powers can come in and begin to execute God's judgment. And I thought this passage was interesting. In verse 15, that these angels had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year. This was not just a random historical happening. Whatever it is that is being described is not just something that randomly, through the vicissitudes of history, happens to Rome. It is something that God has prepared for this moment. God knew this was coming and was ready for it. And they kill 1/3 of mankind. This is a serious affliction, but it is not total. Once more, God is limiting the destruction to give people the opportunity to repent. The number of these horsemen is 200 million. And it's interesting, it says John heard the number. John's as if, okay, I didn't count them. This vision did not last long enough for me to count these horsemen. He just heard there's 200 million of them. The significance of that number, I think, is just that it's an overwhelming force. You're not going to win this war. Whatever restriction, the fact that they only kill 1/3 of mankind is not due to the heroics of the Roman soldier or the strategy of their leaders. It's strictly because God has limited what they can do. So it's an overwhelming force, no hope of defense. And the description, once again, is kind of interesting. The breastplates of the riders are red, blue, and yellow. They're very bright. I really don't know what to make of that, except that it shows a sort of flamboyance almost, or joy in battle. Like they're very happy about destruction, about doing this. And then the horses has like lion, smoke, fire, and brimstone coming from their nostrils. That may be somewhat suggestive of hell and judgment. Once more, another factor that reminds the reader that this is divine judgment. And they have tails like snakes, and there have been some allusions to the Parthians twisting their horses' tails into things that looked like snakes, but it seems to me just another part of the of what we looked at with the locusts, a terrifying image, and certainly something that is not ever going to be opposed by any earthly power. So there is no ability among human beings in any nation to resist the power of this army that is coming against Rome. But they do have power to be rebellious. And so even with this, there is no repentance. Worshipping of idols, they continue, and demons. And I'm wondering if that worship of demons in that is a reference to Caesar, who proclaimed himself to be a god, and John's revelation saying, well, more like a demon. And then all the other list of sexual of sins that the Romans cling to. So I had to get through that last part kind of quickly, but a summary of chapter 9. The fifth trumpet brings locust and non-fatal but terrible torment, which I think, and I didn't make this point strongly enough as we were going through that, a lot of commentators think it is indicative of internal corruption and weakness, internal sin, and bringing about the crumbling of the structure of society. We can see parallels of that in our own nation, frankly. I was thinking about, as I was preparing for this class, it's now been a little over 40 years, I think, since the very liberal researcher Daniel Patrick Moynihan started ringing the warning bell about the ills that resulted from the dissolution of the family in America and how much damage that does to the country. And we've known about this for 4 decades or more, and nobody seems to care. Nobody's doing anything, to strengthen the family. In fact, we do more and more to weaken it, and there's a lot of our country that like to do away with the idea completely. But we see that immorality is weakening our country, just as immorality weakened Rome. And then the sixth angel brought, or the sixth trumpet brought 200. I left off some zeros. 200 million horsemen, and the death of a third of mankind, and the opportunity for repentance that was ignored. And the take-home message from that was that God's judgment was prepared beforehand, that God had planned this out in advance and knew what was going to happen. And sorry to rush through the end of that, but thank you very much. And Bart will be back, I expect, next week.